Now, I'd like to invite Reverend Derek Austin to come and give us the message this morning.
Well, it is a pleasure to be with you today. Good morning. As it has been a pleasure getting to know your pastor and becoming friends. One question that keeps popping up, especially in self-identifying progressive churches, and in the wake of last month's presidential inauguration, is where in the world is God in all of this? I can answer that. I'll just come down. And that question reminded me of a story a colleague told me once. There was a woman who moved to a new town, and she had two boys. She was a single mother, and she had two boys that were constantly causing chaos, an 11-year-old and a 9-year-old. And she thought, well, maybe I'll go to the local pastor and invite him over, and maybe he can talk some sense into my boys. So she did, and the pastor came over. This was down in the South, so this is a Southern Baptist preacher. Came over, knocked on the door. The boys were standing in the hallway, saw him when she opened the door, and the younger one bolted down the hall into their bedroom and shut the door. The other one stood frozen. She invited the pastor to walk in. The boys already knew why he was there. And the mother sat the older son down and invited the pastor to sit across from him. And without saying a word, she just kind of gave him the nod to go ahead and say whatever he was going to say. And the pastor looked at the young man and said, "Young man, where in the world is God? Where is God in what you do?" The young boy kind of just shrugged his shoulders, and he was getting a little annoyed, but not sure where the pastor was going with this. And so the pastor leaned forward and said, "Young man, where is God? Where do you think God is?" And the boy kind of shook his head. Now he was getting very uncomfortable, and he's moving around and getting very fidgety, but doesn't answer. And so the pastor gets up, walks across, points his finger, and says, "Young man, where is God?" And the kid bolted. He jumps up. He runs down the hallway. He runs into the bedroom. He slams the door and looks at his younger brother and says, "We are in so much trouble. God's missing. And they think we did it. Where is God?" I'd like to open with a poem by Christina Rossetti entitled "A Better Resurrection." I have no wit, no words or tears. My heart within me, like a stone, is numbed too much for hopes or fears. Look right, look left, I dwell alone. I lift my eyes, but dimmed with grief, no everlasting hills I see. My life is in the falling leaf. O Jesus, quicken me. My life is like an empty bowl, my harvest dwindled to a husk. Truly my life is void and brief and tedious in the barren dusk. My life is like a frozen thing. No bud nor greenness can I see. But will it rise, the sap of spring? O Jesus, rise in me. How many people in our lives might be able to speak those words, whether they're people we know intimately or just barely acquaintances? How many of you could? When I served a church in near Buffalo, New York, I became acquainted with another local pastor that for this morning we'll call Dave. On the day that I met him, and both of us being new to our respective congregations, we began for some reason to start comparing demographics and job descriptions. I assumed that was what Buffalo pastors did, so I played along. And having made friends with another local pastor, another colleague from a congregation that was quite elderly, I knew that that pastor spent a considerable amount of time visiting people in the hospital and in their homes. So it occurred to me to ask Dave if that was also the case with him. "I don't do pastoral care," he said. "I'm there to do leadership development and other more important things. We have lay people who take care of that." And in getting to know him just a little bit more in that brief conversation, I discovered that this wasn't simply a clarification. This was a stipulation of his terms of call. And more amazingly, it seemed to be a point of pride, not simply a quiet declaration or admission. He wanted it that way, he got it that way, and was proud of the deal that he struck. No pastoral care on his plate. At first, I was not impressed. But then in the recesses of my heart, I knew that I couldn't judge him. Because some of those words that he said and those sentiments he expressed at that time just could have been my own. Not that I would ever have uttered them, I was a little smarter than that, but they easily could have been, and that prospect began haunting me. It was amazing how that perspective was able to convince me and subsequently persuade others that my own skills at public address and leadership training and dialogue facilitation were of greater importance than the personal touch and care of another human being. How my lack of interest at that time in this aspect of ministry could have been translated into something that had the ring of sophistication and was therefore easily defended. But being smarter didn't necessarily get me anywhere. My lack of concern for those in my church needing caring attention eventually bubbled up to the surface, rather quickly, in fact, to the point where it did need to be challenged and eventually unlearned. My friend Bob is a minister of a similar mindset. He accepted his last call with that very same stipulation as Dave's. Now, in his case, it wasn't because he was lazy or thoughtless or shallow, nor because he didn't think pastoral care was important or that he didn't care about his own parishioners. For him, it was because he didn't think he was any good at it. And convinced that he would retire in that church, he wanted his last pastorate to be about what he was good at and having the chance to shine in it. And in his mind, pastoral care wasn't the best application of his time because other lay leaders and volunteers that he had gotten to know very early on in his tenure, in his mind, were so much better at the aspects and the ministry of visitation and caregiving. But I was destined for what ended up being to the benefit of us both, to witness a rather stark change in his perspective on that issue. Jeannie was a woman in her 80s. She was alone and had no family. Well, none really to speak of. She had a daughter somewhere in the country, but who had stopped talking to her decades before. Several years back, she was also the unfortunate victim of a hit-and-run accident, one that rendered her handicapped from the waist down. Jeannie resided in an assisted living facility in a quiet part of town, near where Bob lived and pastored, and was a member of the Lutheran church several blocks down from his church. And every Sunday, Jeannie would walk by his church on her way to her own, until that accident, after which she had to use an electric scooter to get anywhere that she wasn't able to be driven. And she hated depending on other people for that. Actually, it's probably better stated that she hated imposing on people for that. On the first Sunday that Jeannie went to church after recovering from her accident and getting her scooter, its battery ran out of charge right in front of Bob's church. Because she didn't want to impose on anyone, she didn't ask for anyone to give her a lift to the Lutheran church. She just kind of rolled herself into his, and she asked if she could recharge her battery somewhere. But as she did, she noticed that the service was about to start and kind of did the math pretty quick in her head and realized there was no way she was going to get to her own church on time. So she charged up, pulled up in the front row, and kind of settled in and worshiped there that morning. Well, she never left. One thing that Jeannie was known for was the amount of fake or faux jewelry that she wore on Sundays. It literally hung everywhere. She was particularly proud of her most recent acquisition, which was a plastic replica of the necklace that was in the movie Titanic. She was very proud of it. And another thing that she was known for was she always spoke up in church when the prayer requests were solicited during worship. My friend Bob thought that she was politically very conservative for years because she would frequently quote President Bush. This was during his term, his second term, on something he had said earlier in the week, and she asked for prayer for him. So my friend Bob, being a staunch liberal, fully admitted that this grated against him like nails on a chalkboard. But Jeannie, oblivious to his discomfort, continued this practice until Barack Obama became president. At which point Bob thought, well, at least she'll be quiet. But she wasn't. She simply started quoting him and asking for prayers for him and his leadership of the country. It soon became clear that she wasn't conservative or liberal. She was just Jeannie, who simply actually cared for showing respect and praying for her government leaders, no matter who they were or what slice of the political pie that they came from. So when my friend got the phone call late one night, after midnight actually, that Jeannie was in the hospital with congestive heart failure and had listed him not as her minister, but as her next of kin, he sat there puzzled, wrestling with whether or not to go see her. She was unconscious and would likely go into a coma, the nurse had told him on the phone. And it was late, very late. I was visiting him at the time, and not really wanting to leave the house that late, he asked me a question that he very well knew the answer to. If she's in a coma, is it worth going to see her? Do you think that she'd be able to hear me or even know that I was there if I went to visit? He asked. But Bob knew the answer to that question. That yes, she most likely would, at least according to hundreds of patients and dozens of research studies. So reluctantly, we got in the car at 12:45 a.m. and left for the hospital. When we got there, They told us that, yes, Jeannie had slipped into a coma and had not responded to any stimulus since she arrived. Her lungs were filling up, and all they could do was make her comfortable as they awaited the inevitable. We went inside of her room and over to her gurney. Bob reached out his hand and took hers. We were the only ones there, no one else had come. I, being on the other side of her bed and close to the machines, noticed, for whatever reason, some of the numbers that were on the monitors. Her blood pressure was quite low, as you probably can imagine. Her heartbeat was 32. 32. And another number that I couldn't determine what it represented registered as 119. In my ignorance, I thought it might be tracking brain waves or some other thing, but I simply didn't know. But what I did know was that as my friend began saying her name, that number began to change. Bob continued to talk softly to Jeannie as though he was calling out to her, yet knowing that she would not physically respond. So you can imagine our shock when she did. Jeannie's heartbeat stayed the same, as though she was still in a comatose state. But whatever that thing that was reflected by the 119 number shot up to over 4,000 in a matter of seconds. And at the very same time, Jeannie opened her eyes. She registered recognition of my friend as he was talking to her. Even tried to answer his questions by moving her mouth, but we couldn't make out anything she was trying to say because of the oxygen mask that was over her face. After listening to him for a few moments, she looked over at me, and then she looked back at him, and tears were streaming down Jeannie's face. Bob told her that everyone back home was thinking of her, that he would be back in the morning to check on her again. He prayed for her himself and told her to go back to sleep. And then, as quickly as Jeannie opened her eyes, she closed them again. That 4,000 number dove back down to below 200. And she was once again unconscious. Bob and I sat in silence in the car ride back home, and upon arriving and pulling into the driveway, he turned the car off and we just sat there for 5 more minutes in the car, not saying a word, until both of us, pretty much at the same time, said that this was one of the most amazing pastoral moments that we had ever experienced. God had tugged at his heart to go visit her and pulled Jeannie out of an unconscious state just long enough for her to see that there were those who genuinely cared for her. People who had become her family despite losing her own. Bob and his congregation were the ones that were with her now, including the God who had every intention of letting her know that they were there and to experience that love. The value of that moment, that brief extension of care that barely cost either of us anything at all, was immeasurably valuable to Jeannie. She had found a home with Bob and these people before facing the possibility that she was being called by God to transition to her next one. And the epiphany about the power of this seemingly small gesture was engraving itself on the minds of both of us. in the best and most unexpected of ways. The entrepreneur Jim Rohn said, "One person caring about another represents life's greatest value." Brian Tracy, who was the author of the Motivational Phoenix Seminar, added this: "In life, you can never be too kind or too fair because everyone you meet is carrying a heavy load." And the late Henry Nouwen, which we heard quoted moments ago, said that it is those who have chosen to share our pain and touch our wounds with a tender hand, those who can be silent with us in our despair and confusion. It's those, in the end, that mean the most to us. Love one another, both Jesus and the Apostle John said. Chief Seattle, who was the leader of the Suquamish Native American tribe, after whom, obviously, Seattle, Washington was named, he wrote the following: "Humankind has not woven the web of life. We are but one thread within it. Whatever we do to the web, we do to ourselves. All things are bound together. All things are connected." I met and spent a grand total of only 10 minutes with Jeannie, but I fell in love with her. The sheer look of love and of desperate need and of appreciation for us being there was palpable. It was as if, should Jesus ever have been all alone and desperately afraid, he would have looked like Jeannie did. So genuinely scared and yet so genuinely grateful, all in one simultaneous moment. And I couldn't escape the verse that many of us were taught in Sunday school, when Jesus said, "If you have done these things for the least of these, you have done them for me." If you, like me at one time, think that learning how to care genuinely and effectively for one another is a waste of time, or the pastor's or someone else's job, or just something that you think you're probably not all that good at, think again. You could be the very vehicle for God to breathe comfort, affirmation, acceptance, and encouragement into someone else's life, perhaps at one of the most poignant and vulnerable moments of need. You can have the supreme opportunity of being the incarnation of God to that person in that moment. And you may never know the full extent of the gift your time and attention might be to them. I can't speak for Bob, but I can say that something changed inside of me that night, something that had to change. All the leadership development and training and I had inaugurated, all the sermons that I had and would focus so much time in preparing, all the grand dialogue I had facilitated within and between congregations, they would never be able to replace what happened there at the bedside of that hospital room. Because in that moment, when Jeannie and Bob and I and God were all together, all she needed was to somehow see the face of Jesus looking at her. And when God used us to be just that, God turned it around and took Jeannie's eyes and looked right back at us. Would you pray with me, please? Build compassion into us in new ways, O God. Help us see through different eyes. Hold up a divine mirror to us of our own lives, where we thrive and where we fall short. Give us tenacity, drive, sensitivity, and courage to reach out. Make us uncomfortable with hesitation and thoughtlessness. Help us see ourselves in others, our own needs, our own shortcomings, to minister to theirs. We invite you to be a beacon of light through us for those who need it to pierce a moment of darkness and bring them your compassion. Amen.